Previously, I covered database mirroring as a high availability option for SQL Server. Today, I'll cover another popular high availability option, which is LogShipping. LogShipping automatically ships transaction logs to another server. You can also set up LogShipping to send out logs to multiple servers. With database mirroring, you don't have the option to copy to multiple servers. You can only copy to one server. When you set up LogShipping, SQL Server will create 3 SQL agent jobs. The first one, which is on the primary server, will back up the transaction log. The second job is on the secondary server, and that one will copy the log backup from the primary server to the secondary server. And the third job is also on the secondary server. This one will restore the log backup, which replays the log entries onto the secondary database. To set up LogShipping, the database has to be in full recovery mode. Here I have 2 SQL Server instances. The default instance, this one will be my primary server. And here the SQL 1 name instance, this will be my secondary server. I have a database testdb1, which is what I'm going to LogShip onto this secondary server, which currently has no databases. To set up LogShipping, the database has to be in full recovery mode. And we could check that, make sure that it is set to the right recovery mode. Under Options, for recovery model, we have full. So the first step in setting up LogShipping is to initialize the database on the secondary server. This means we need to take a full backup of the primary database as well as a transaction log backup and restore those onto the secondary server. So first I'm going to take a full backup of testdb1, and I'm also going to take a transaction log backup. And save it into that same file. Now on the secondary server, we'll need to restore that. Restore the database as testdb1, and we want to restore both the database backup and the transaction log backup. Now under files, I'm just going to change the location of the physical file here. On the options page, we need to set the recovery state. We can set it to either no recovery or standby. With either one of these options, it leaves the database in a state where it can continue replaying transaction log files. With no recovery, it leaves the database inaccessible. You won't be able to access any data from it. With standby, it leaves the database in read-only mode. So you can still query the database and get data from it. So I'm going to choose standby. And with standby, it creates this extra file, this standby file, with an extension .bak. In previous versions of SQL Server, this used to be a .tuf file, which stood for Transaction Undo File. It It's a different extension now, but it still serves the same purpose. It contains the information on modifications made as part of any incomplete transactions at the time the backup was made. This file is required and is automatically generated when you configure LogShipping in standby mode. So once you have your recovery stage set, you press enter or click OK. And now we have the database restored. And if we look at our secondary instance, we see the database is now there in standby mode and read-only. So the database is now fully initialized. Now that the secondary database is initialized, the next step in creating LogShipping is right-click on the database and go to Properties. Go to Transaction LogShipping, and now we want to enable Primary Database. First, we need to set up the backup settings. Here, we specify where we want the backup file to go. That's the share location, and this is the physical location. We can set the retention period for these backups. And also, if the backup doesn't occur after a certain amount of time, an alert will be set out. Here we could set the threshold for that alert. And for the schedule, let's set it to run every 2 minutes for this demo. And once that's set, we could click OK or press enter. Now we set up the secondary databases. Let's connect to our secondary server, and we want to restore onto testDB1, which is already initialized. So on this first tab, Initialize Secondary Database, we already initialized the database, so we could choose this third option. No, the secondary database is initialized. If we didn't go through those steps of backing up the database and transaction log and restoring, we can use one of these options, which will do it for you. Since we already did it, we could just choose this third option and continue to the next page. Here we set the destination folder for the copy files. So we want the copy to go to the backup folder, the backup share for the secondary server. And again, we could set the retention period. And now let's set the schedule. For the schedule, let's run it also every 2 minutes, but let's run it starting at 12:01. This way it runs on the odd minute, so every 1, 3, 5, 7 minutes, while the backup will run on the 0, 2, 4, 6 just for this demo, so they don't overlap each other. So on the restore transaction log, here again we have the option to do no recovery or standby mode. We'll choose standby. And for this option, delay restoring backups at least. So this allows you to delay replaying your log files if you have a need for that. If you don't want the log to immediately get replayed onto the secondary server, you could set this threshold. And again, for this, you could also set the alert threshold for whenever a restore doesn't happen. Under schedule, I'm going to set this to also run every 2 minutes. and click OK. Now we have our secondary database set up. We can add more databases, which is a great option for LogShipping. We can LogShip to multiple SQL instances. So now we're set up. We click OK, and it's going to go through the steps to create and set up those SQL agent jobs. Now that's done, if we go to the primary server and take a look at the agent jobs, we'll see that here is a job to back up the transaction logs. And on the secondary server, we'll see that there are two jobs here. One is to copy the transaction log from the primary to the secondary, and another job is to restore that transaction log onto the secondary database. So let's see if changes on the primary server will get replayed onto the secondary server. In this testDB1, we have a table called products, and there are two records. So let's add a third record to there. So now we have three records. Let's log into the secondary server, secondary database. And since the backup and restore hasn't happened here yet, we should still see that there are only two records here. Okay. Now, once the backup runs and then the copy and the restore runs, the data that we just inserted should appear in that secondary server. So instead of waiting for the schedule to kick off, I'm just going to kick this off manually. So the backup file is created, and we could see that this is the one that we just created at 10:41. Now if we go to the secondary server, that file hasn't been copied yet. So here we can kick this off manually to copy that over. And we see that here it is now. And the restore just kicked off. So this should restore this transaction log onto the secondary database. So once that's done, the third record should show up in this database. So let's try rerunning the query, and now we see that the TV record is now replayed onto this secondary database. Now if the primary database goes down, you can bring up the secondary database. To do that, we need to bring it out of standby mode. And the command to do that is restore database, database name with recovery. Database is restored. If we refresh this now, we'll see that the database is back online. And this concludes how to set up and configure LogShipping. In my next video, I'll go over how to set up reverse LogShipping, which will make your secondary server your primary and your primary server your secondary. This is very useful when you want to reverse the roles of the servers and not have to redo a full backup. Sometimes the databases can have very large backups, and if you're log shipping from, say, a location in the US with a location in Europe, copying that full backup to a European location can take a very long time. With reverse log shipping, you won't need to create that full backup and fully go through that initialization step. You can reverse the roles of these servers quite easily, and I'll show you how to do that in my next video for 2012. Today, I'll go over how to reverse log shipping, and the secondary database becomes the primary. And I'm going to show you how to do it in a way that you don't need to take a full backup. This technique is useful when you have a very large database and when the primary and secondary servers are located far apart. For admins that have set up log shipping before, you know that the step that usually takes up the most time is the initialization, getting that full backup onto the secondary server and restoring it. For example, if the primary server is located in New York and the secondary server is located somewhere in Europe, it can take several hours just to back up the large database, copy it onto the secondary server, and restore it there. I'll show you how to reverse log shipping without having to do that. Here I have two servers. On the default instance, this is my primary server with the testdb1 primary database being log shipped onto the second server. So what we're going to do here is we're going to reverse the roles of these two databases, making this one the primary database, and which will log ship to here, and making this our secondary database. So to do that, first we need to disable the job that backs up the transaction log on the primary server. Once we do that, we go to the secondary server and first run the copy job to copy any remaining transaction log backups from the primary server onto the secondary server. Then run the restore job to restore those remaining transaction log backups. After those jobs run, we can disable those jobs. So now all the log shipping jobs are disabled, and we know that the secondary database is up to date up to the last transaction log backup from the primary database. So now let's create one more transaction log backup on the primary server. And this time, when we take the backup, we're also going to set the primary database to no recovery mode. This way, we know that there will be no more changes to the primary database after the log backup finishes. Setting it to no recovery also leaves the primary database in a state that is ready to restore transaction log backups. So we're on the primary server, and let's back up, take one last backup of the log. And when we take this log backup, we need to set the database to no recovery. Okay. Now if you refresh the primary server, you'll see that testdb1 is now in restoring state. Now let's go on to the secondary server and restore that last transaction log backup that we just took. And this time when we restore it, we're going to recover the database and bring it back online. And to bring it back online, the command we use is with recovery. So the database on the secondary server, if we refresh it, is back online. So at this point, we know that these two databases have the exact same data. Now we could go on and set up LogShipping from what is now our primary database to the secondary database. And since the database on the secondary server is already initialized, we don't need to take a full backup of our primary database to restore onto the secondary. We can skip that step and just configure the LogShipping settings. So that's the backup share, and this is the physical backup location. And now to add a secondary database, which is now the default instance. That database is already initialized. Again, we could set this to either no recovery or standby, and with standby, it will leave the database in read-only mode. Okay, so now that created the SQL agent jobs. If we take a look on the primary server now, or the default instance, which is now the secondary server, here was the original backup that we disabled. We can just go ahead and delete that. You see that now, since this is the secondary server, it has the copy job and the restore job. And now if we go to the name instance, SQL1, that used to be the secondary server, it used to have the copy job and the restore job. Now if we refresh, we'll see that it has the backup job. So we could go ahead and delete those copy and restore jobs. We won't need those anymore. And now to test, let's go on to our name instance, which is our primary server now. There's currently 3 records in there. Now let's make a change in and delete one of the records. So now there's only 2 records. Instead of waiting for the schedule to kick off, I'm just going to run this manually. So first, back up the transaction log on the primary database. Next, copy that backup onto the secondary location, secondary server. And then restore that transaction log backup. Now once this is done, since we configured LogShipping to set the database to be in standby mode, when we refresh this, it should change it to standby, and it does. So now let's go to this secondary server, connect to our secondary database, and when we query this, we should only see 2 records, and we do. So now the LogShipping roles are reversed. This used to be the primary server, this was the secondary, now this is the primary and this is the secondary, and we didn't have to perform a full backup and initialization.